Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. There's a few people also from Asia still connecting at this late hour, so I'm very grateful that you could join us on this virtual event series on COVID-19 business recovery scenarios. I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to be with you. You know, we live in extraordinary times. I think everybody has kind of been through very difficult situations in the past couple of months. And actually, let me start by saying that I hope that we find you all well and healthy, and that your families are safe, and that we're managing through this, and we can concentrate on talking about business today and how to recover. We are in also in an unprecedented situation. You know, a good proportion of the population of the world was in a lockdown for several weeks. In some countries, including my own, we're beginning now to release some of those lockdown restrictions, and demand has taken a suffering across the world. So today what we want to do is to look at an opportunity to see how to bring together businesses and collectively give ideas and thoughts in terms of how to propel the response and the recovery in the most sustainable way. Both sustainable in terms of time, but equally in terms of making sure that sustainability is at the center of the business recovery. And this is important because as the crisis unfolds, we know that the business is still a key contributor to our world. And so given that we've gone through a major crisis, we shouldn't, in a way, if you'll allow me, let it go to waste. We should use it to the best full extent in terms of recovering in the most sustainable manner. And so today we want to share with you some ideas and thoughts in terms of what businesses can do towards that. So with that, let me just move on to the next slide, please. I want to get a couple of housekeeping items out of the way. The first one is I want to just read through the antitrust statement reminder. As you know, WBCSD works in a pre-competitive space. So we want to make sure that we avoid any discussions or conversation that relates to pricing, cost, bid strategies, capacity, customers, or output decisions. There's, you know, on the call, there's companies that are adjacent, if not direct competitors. Please refrain from exchanging any views, including the chat function. If you feel there's any conversation that are beginning to feel uncomfortable for you, please let me know, and we will stop the conversation right there. The other housekeeping statement I want to go through is that the session is being recorded. We want to use it to share it with you, participants, so that you can also share it inside your companies, but also for those who didn't manage to participate because of schedules. Everybody is going to be muted in a listen-only mode, just to make sure that we preserve the bandwidth and the flow of the conversation. Everything will be available during the next 36 hours. If you do have a question, there's a chat function. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you see a bar where you see the participants. Next to it, you see a chat button. And there, if you click it, you are able to put your question through. I'll be monitoring that and making sure that we address them either in writing there, or we'll table it so that we can address it as part of the presentation today. Before we get started on the core of the presentation, I just want to give you the context of where this work fits. Back in March, as we were getting into a lockdown, at WBCSD, we recognized that our 200 member companies really have an opportunity and a duty to really bring together the collective action in response to the COVID crisis. And so as a result, back in March, we set up 3 different projects to respond to that. The first one is that we're working on keeping vital supply chains going. And here we're focusing primarily on the food security system. So essentially, we want to make sure with our member companies that food gets to the people that are in a lockdown, regardless of where they live. The second project is really at the core of what we want to look at today, which is really the return to new normal scenarios. So after the lockdown and the shutdown, we wanted to make sure that businesses are able to bring their employees back to work in a healthy and sustainable way. And equally, the recovery from the crisis happens smoothly and by putting a sustainability at the core so as to make sure that we rebuild back better. The third project looks at the long-term impact. And so as part of the Vision 2050 refresh currently underway at WBCSD, we're looking at what can we learn from this current crisis that can really move the needle in terms of future resilience of business and opportunities, including moving from shareholder to real stakeholder capitalism. We do have a governance process in place where we actually manage these as short-term projects with clear deliverables, and we're getting good support and good traction from our members in terms of leading this work. So today we're going to talk about the second project. So it's the return to new normal, particularly focused on the business recovery. Obviously, this work, as usual, members for us, our guiding star. So none of this work would be possible without them. So I just want to list the 200 member companies that are either directly or indirectly working on some of these issues. We're very grateful for their support, and you represent part of that support today. One last thing I want to tell you is that we do have a website on the COVID response, wbcsd.org/COVID-19. There you see several interesting things. You see some case studies in terms of what companies are doing. And in addition to that, we have a repository for what businesses, the good practices that businesses are putting in place to get their employees healthily back to work. If you do have some good examples, we would appreciate if you could send them in, and we'll give them exposure on that platform. Great. Okay. There's also plenty of opportunities for us to collaborate and to get your input. So I hope we can keep you awake. We're going to use Mentimeter, and I would like to use this as a kind of a question to set ourselves up. And to do that, Miriam Marchand, who from WBCSD, will help us to get through the technical hurdles. Miriam, would you mind to give us an instruction on how to work on this?
Absolutely. So for those who are new to the system, you can actually access this via your phone, your tablet, or your computer. You just need to go to menti.com and use the code that you see on the top of the screen. As soon as you start voting, we'll see that the results will start popping up on your screen.
That's great. So hopefully we're gonna be able to collaborate on that. So just a few moments to get your input. Okay, social media. We've got 5 answers possible: social media, WBCSD mailing list, WBCSD website, partner network, and others. Just while we wait for the last responses to come in and for you to log on, I was checking about the registration. We have about 40% of the participants. So right now there's 60 participants. A few more might be coming now, joining us now. About 40% of them are member companies. We touch on the, I see that from the registration that we're touching on people that are senior leaders, but also outside the sustainability function. There's strategists, there's supply chain leaders, operations, which is great because it gives us an opportunity to really get input and provide some ideas to them. About 40% are guests, and half of those are from academia, half of them are from business. Again, a different variety of different functions. And then the rest is network partners. So we have a good spread of participants. Good. I see that we've got 22 responses. We've got about a bit under a third. So I encourage you to log in and participate. www.menti.com. 761283 is the code. And please sign up, because we'll be using this in a couple of other times. So it would be great to have your input on some of the ideas that we're putting forward. So with that, I see that, right, good. All right, we can move on. So before we go further, I am honored to tell you that this work has been taking place thanks to the great support that we are receiving from the Boston Consulting Group. We are grateful for their support and their continued support of WBCSD that provided us a lot of the starting blocks and a lot of the material that you will see. In fact, you will see in the course of the presentation that the slides have a kind of a joint layout, because we want to give the credit and visibility to the great work that we've been doing, and in combining it with some of the thoughts at WBCSD. We have the privilege of having three speakers, two that will be active on this particular session. Wendy Woods is Vice Chair of Social Impact at the Boston Consulting Group. Wendy works with corporates, with government, with the social sector to define strategy for private and public partnerships. She also leads the relationship with Save the Children, with the World Food Programme, WWF, the Union Social Business, and so really is very knowledgeable in terms of both the business, but also the world of the public and the nonprofit. So it's ideally placed in terms of giving us some of her thoughts and observations with regards to the crisis, the pandemic, and the difficult situation that we're coming out of. Naomi Desai is one of the project leaders at BCG today. In fact, this morning, because we had earlier on in the middle of the night for North America, a great presentation on the case study that we'll be walking through again on FMCGs. Today, we'll also welcome Shalini Unakrishnan, who is Managing Director and Partner at BCG. Total societal impact practice, very accustomed with the FMCG sector vertical, works extensively with the companies in that industry to define impact strategies, has worked in several countries, and I also read that she's not new to crisis situations, particularly Ebola crisis. So somebody that is obviously, unfortunately, very knowledgeable about difficult situations and how to surface out of them. And so we'll be glad to hear from her about her impressions of what we're living through. So before we go and provide that opportunity, I think that the reason why we're having this project, and particularly this webinar, is that we all recognize that COVID-19 is a real challenge, but it also represents opportunities, and the recovery from COVID-19 is one of those great opportunities. Some executives have defined it almost as a small window of opportunity to make sure that we emerge stronger. In fact, you probably read quite extensively that we talk about building back better, but rather we should think about building forward better. We shouldn't be looking at what we left behind pre-COVID as the best. We should be looking at how to build the best in the future. And that best is one that addresses not just the current crisis, but also some of the huge challenges that the world is facing from a sustainability perspective. Climate, diversity, inclusion, nature. These are some of the key themes that I think we have to use this opportunity as collective businesses to address and come out stronger. So if we just go to the next slide on today's agenda, why do we talk about it now? Because right now is a catalyst to build forward better in a way, to build back better or to recover from the current situation in a stronger situation. We do have, we're going to cover some context in terms of the scenarios different scenarios that we are living through. Different geographies and different countries are living through different status of the pandemic. The macroeconomic situation is different. So we're covering some of those economic recovery scenarios as a starting point. But very importantly, then point 3, we will cover a COVID-19 recovery checklist. And this is going to be a very practical and detailed roadmap or framework in which to think, for businesses to think of how to begin the recovery process. And we will cover a very interesting example on how this applies to the FMCG industry. We are planning other verticals, but today we want to focus on this as a prime example. And then we'll close by taking some of your feedback. And but we will have opportunities to do that as we go along at different places during the course of the agenda. So with that, I would like to invite Wendy to take us through some of your thoughts, if you don't mind, Wendy.
Certainly. Thank you, Federico. And it's been an absolute pleasure to partner with WBCSD on this work. We really hope that today we're going to have the opportunity to offer you some encouragement and some tools to really think about, as Federico says, building forward better and doing more to incorporate sustainability and inclusion. All of us in our businesses and our organizations are being forced to integrate through this recovery and through all of the challenges we're facing. So how do we make sure we can most effectively build in that sustainability and that inclusiveness lens into all of the work and all of the creativity that we are currently having to bring to bear? And that's what we're going to be talking about today and all of those agenda topics that Federico laid out for us. I hope most of you, and I know based on the participant list that some of you are quite familiar with BCG, but very briefly, for those of you who aren't, BCG is a management consulting firm. We've got 90 offices around the world and 21,000 people. Our purpose is to unlock the potential of those who advance the world. So we work primarily with businesses, but also with investors, governance, and social sector. In my role in social impact, I work across that full suite of our clients, primarily with businesses, but with all the other sectors as well. We really try to make sure that we are having a positive impact on society and protecting our planet in all of the work that we do. We try really hard more and more to embed those lenses into any project that we are undertaking for our clients, either explicitly or sometimes it's just more implicit in the way we actually approach the work and the way we approach diagnostic or strategy. But we really do try to make that center stage, which is why this work with WBCSD is so dear and from our perspective, so important moving forward. As it relates to COVID, we're working with the majority of our clients in one way, shape, or form. For those being challenged by increasing demand, which certainly happens in some sectors, we're thinking about allocations and how you actually meet that increasing demand. In other cases, we're actually helping our clients through liquidity situations. And in addition, on the government and social sector side, there's about 150 governments around the world that we are helping with the decision making as they seek to provide stimulus, support the economy, and yet at the same time protect the population and mitigate the spread of COVID-19. We can move forward. Just in terms of the lens that we take for businesses, and this is the lens that we are actually bringing to bear as we thought about how do we build forward better in this moment of COVID. But we actually call the way we approach this with our corporate clients total societal impact and sustainability. It incorporates the dimensions that everyone I think thinks of first about environmental stability and access and inclusion when we talk about societal impact. But we try to be more comprehensive than that, and we try to make sure we're thinking about all of the positive impacts that corporates have on society, be that the employment footprint and the economic vitality that corporations can build. And also when we think about some of those other dimensions, making sure that we're thinking about them as broadly and holistically as we can. Thinking about lifetime well-being for employees and customers, not just at a moment in time. Thinking about building ethical capacity, both within the company, but also what spreads into society, and really enabling society. I have been quite heartened and find one of the silver linings of the COVID challenge that we're grappling with is a lot of the work that companies are doing to lead and support society broadly beyond their core business outcomes. Continue to move forward. So in this moment in time, as Federico talks about, it's really unique. I think one of the things that I find as a silver lining is more and more organizations and businesses are realizing how interconnected we all are. The impact that our behaviors have and our organization's behaviors have on others in our supply chain, in our customer base, and more broadly in the community are becoming starkly illustrated in a way that we may not have felt as tangibly before. We all know that we're being forced to innovate, we're being forced to improve, we're going to have to build, and we're going to have to build better. Let's build forward better and not retrench to some of the more insular behavior or some of the behavior that didn't incorporate people and planet much more broadly. I also want to offer, and where we're going to go next for a couple of minutes, is some encouragement and the fact that this is not about just being altruistic. Certainly it is the right thing to do. And those of us are trying very hard to do the right thing in most of our companies. But I also think we can realize that it's the thing that actually does get rewarded. It gets rewarded by our investors, it gets rewarded by the market. And so where we're gonna go now is sharing a little bit of that data. So hopefully, so you feel like it's not quite such an uphill battle in the midst of everything we're all being asked to do at this busy moment in time, to really think about what we need to do to build in that inclusiveness and sustainability. I just want us to take a chance to realize that it does actually get rewarded. I think this is a really important chart, so I'll spend a minute here, which is if we just look at the performance of ESG funds in the market during the time of COVID in most of the world. We don't start until February is where we started the index from. But if you look at how those ESG funds have performed, they have significantly outperformed the overall market. And one of the questions I get asked some of the time is, oh, is that just sectorial weighting? It's not. If you actually take all the sectors and actually look at the best performing in terms of ESG performance and mark that to the market performance, what you see is this trend. WBCSD also looks at its member stocks, and WBCSD member stocks, which we know are people who pay more attention to sustainability issues, are also outperforming the North American equity market and the European equity market. So very encouraging in terms of companies that are doing the right thing at this moment in time are being rewarded. They were rewarded before, but a lot of people were asking the question, does that hold? Does that advantage hold during COVID? It certainly does. The other thing that we're actually hearing, we do investor surveys constantly and are in dialogue with a lot of investors. What we've learned from our surveys and our dialogue is that a large portion of investors, 45% in our last survey, said that companies should absolutely continue to fully pursue their ESG agenda. And a number of them are saying, and potentially even disproportionately so, they're taking this as a window in time and a moment in time where those who do will actually gain lasting competitive advantage. And so 45% of the investors in our last survey said, yes, keep pushing on this. And they actually said, keep pushing at it, even at the expense of some EPS and earnings per share. They realize that this is a moment in time where, given all of the innovation required, given all the challenge in the market, given some of the stimulus that's required, some earnings per share may need to be sacrificed in the service of the longer term performance, and the investors see the sustainability inclusion in the service of the longer term performance. So there is some both outperformance and some flexibility and forgiveness from many investors on how corporations think about environmental and social governance. So hopefully that's a little bit of incentive to make you realize that you actually have some room and some flexibility. The other thing that I think is encouraging here is the partnership and the support that we are seeing from governments. What you see on this page is just a sampling. This is by no means comprehensive, but a sampling of the stimulus funds that are being put in by governments around the world. The size of this funding is completely unprecedented, incredibly overweighted to this crisis, even as we compare to the financial crisis that happened in 08 and 09. Much, much higher level of stimulus flowing in much more quickly, being deployed much more seamlessly than it was a decade ago during the last crisis. And when we look at the percentage of the GDP, 10, 20, 30, into almost 40% of the GDP is being captured in terms or deployed in terms of stimulus funds in many places around the world. So the amount of effort that the public sector is putting in, the amount of fluidity in terms of its support for the private sector at this moment in time is completely unprecedented. It's also for many of the folk asking the question of whether we see at times a real disconnect between our stock markets and the real economy, our financial markets. A lot of it is because of the confidence that the financial markets have right now in the deployment of these stimulus funds and in the belief that government is supporting the economy in unprecedented ways. Now, for those of us who are focusing on sustainability and inclusion, one of the most heartening things is some of the requirements and the ties that we are seeing governments put on the deployment of those funds. Here's a very small sample. There's more countries around the world doing this type of requirement or tie to access the stimulus funds. But what we see are countries like Canada who are tying the deployment of funding from the stimulus and the relief packages for businesses to TCFD reporting. And Canada's requiring that companies that take relief funds and stimulus funds actually report through TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, to support environmental efforts. Europe and Germany are putting in significant funding on the climate agenda, tied with the recovery funds and actually in support of stimulating the economy. South Korea is going a Green New Deal. India has put significant money in a tied way. And while there is less happening on the inclusion side, I think that is also something I want to spend time on, super important. And I think we saw something quite unique in South Africa, where they actually tied some of the aid to their Black empowerment policies to promote inclusion there. So some of the structures and the requirements that governments are putting around this are very, very supportive to the businesses that are doing more on sustainability and, in one case, inclusion. All right, Federico, I'm going to hand back to you, I think, for our next poll.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you for the context and for the encouragement. It seems like from a business perspective, a crisis we should not put to waste. But let's hear the feedback from the participants. So we, hands on your mobile device or on the browser, go to Mentimeter. We have a question for you. How has COVID-19 impacted your organization? Organization's view of the importance of sustainability. Miriam, would you mind providing the instructions once again for us to operate this, to provide feedback?
Of course. So please take your tablet, your computer, or your phone, and using your browser, go to menti.com and fill in the code 761283. That will give you a chance to vote.
Great, thank you for that, Miriam. Let's hopefully be able to collect the feedback. It'll be shown in real time on the screen. While you do that, I just wanted to cover some of I recently saw a survey conducted by our partner and friends at BSR. They have surveyed a group of companies, 102 to be precise, just over 100. With a little bit of an over quota of North American business, 58%, Europe and other. And they asked them what short-term sustainability team involvement during the COVID response. And the three main responses were related to, the sustainability teams have been involved with community engagement for 19% of the responses, support to business, which is not surprising, particularly at the time when we're trying to keep everybody safe and healthy and keeping the businesses going. And the third most frequent response was stakeholder engagement. And so working, with other stakeholders in the organization. Okay, we've got 20 responses. Can we just go back and see the response? Thank you for that. So we've got 20. Okay, good. Seems like very strong response in terms of more importance for sustainability in your organization. Certainly, if you combine it with equal, so it's equal or more is certainly the great majority of the responses, which of course is very a positive from our perspective. It really puts this webinar and this ideas really at the center of what we're all trying to achieve. We have a shared perspective. Okay, I suggest we move on to the next question. So given the attention that you're giving, what are your sustainability priorities in COVID-19 recovery and restart? And here you can type your text, and we'll be showing some of the responses as they come through in terms of a word map. So what are your sustainability priorities in COVID-19 recovery and restart? Okay, while you're doing that, I just want to share just a personal reflection in terms of how I felt that while I was stuck in front of my screen in a lockdown during the past 10 weeks, how fast things have happened in some circumstances. But just to give you an example, just think about some of the things that usually take years have taken weeks, if not days. I'm thinking of all the education, all the children and university students that were able to convert from traditional teaching methods over to electronic virtual teaching. I mean, normally you would have expected this to create years of debate, while in a crisis situation, things have happened so much faster. And so is there an opportunity for us to be able to attempt to do the same thing as far as some of the challenges that we're facing beyond the health crisis that we all have in front of us? Okay, we've got a few more responses coming through. Okay, we got 12. I'm beginning to see some pattern with ESG right at the center of top of mind of the respondents. We've got health and safety, of course, which is kind of healthy from the perspective. I think we're all concerned with keeping, employees and teams and their families healthy through the crisis. But we also see green recovery, ESG, focusing right at the center. And then a whole bunch of different ideas, quite a few, from reimagining the future, ethical business transparency, climate change, water availability, sustainable development. Some of the things that have been forced on us, paperless technology, paperless office. Great. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. That would be great. If that's okay, I would like to, we've got a couple more, so let's give it a second. Great. With that, Wendy, would you mind to take us through some of the thinking related to scenarios and some of the practical advice that you're providing us?
Of course. And just to set some context for this section, the macroeconomic and even the industry recovery is really just that. It is context. It is not deterministic in how we do. There's a lot that we can drive with our own actions, both how we think about reopening, how we think about rebuilding and supporting our stakeholders, our shareholders, our customers, our employees, but also if we really think forward, how we can actually leverage our actions now to build sustainable comparative and competitive advantage and really capture the value of that in our performance. And so let's move forward and let's talk about these scenarios, right? The way we think about scenarios, again, it's context, it's not deterministic. We do believe scenarios are incredibly important because there are two things that we know for sure. The first is that ambiguity is a given. We are going to be surprised. We're going to be surprised because there's a lot that is unknown about this novel virus, and we are learning as we go around the virus trajectory. And government response, why is becoming more reliable and in many cases, in many places in the world, more facile and quicker, right? There is a lot that is unknown on exactly what government is going to be able to do given that unknown novel virus trajectory. But those macroeconomic drivers of the virus trajectory and the government response are just that. They're a part of the context that all of us in our corporate or organizational environment is living within. There's another more micro set, which is the business and industry drivers. And this is our industry or sector or business specific demand. As I said, in some places, this may be unprecedented in the sheer volume of demand we have in some places when you think about some fast moving consumer goods and the demand that we've seen for some staples like toilet paper recently. There's also the individual company response that is actually shaping things. So when we think about scenarios, we need to think about all four of these dimensions. And we also need to think about them in the near term, in terms of what we're grappling with, and in the longer term, in terms of what we're grappling with. And so it actually requires us to really stretch forward. So if I back up to that virus trajectory and some of the macroeconomic context, right? What are we seeing now in terms of the waves of the virus? As we begin to reopen, how much flexibility do we have while we're still controlling that trajectory, versus where actually may we be forced in some places or in some situation or in some denser environments, maybe we were forced to maintain some of the strictness in terms of the constraints that we've had for even longer. What do we have to hope to look forward to as we think about medium or longer term? What do we hope to look forward to in terms of a very effective therapeutic or potentially a preventative like a vaccine, right? A lot of conversation is happening about a vaccine and how fast that could be available. We're hearing on the upside potentially next year. I also know, having done a lot of global health work in the past, that the fastest vaccine the world has ever developed took 5 years. And so how do we think about planning forward in those scenarios where we're not sure how long it's going to take to get an effective therapeutic or certainly an effective preventative like a vaccine? So thinking through all of these macroeconomic drivers, as well as our industry-specific drivers, near-term and long-term, are the building blocks of the scenarios for the economic recovery that we are all going to be operating within. It is not deterministic for us, but it is important to understand that because it does shape in some ways our degrees of freedom and does direct us to those things that may be more material for us to operate on sooner rather than later, be it normal financial and liquidity preservation, or be it those sustainability and inclusiveness aspects that we're all trying to maximize building in. So if I dig in a little bit on these recovery scenarios, and I imagine some of you have seen some of it, but I'll actually start pretty broad because I think this is just quite important to understand the dynamics around this. When we talk about our recovery scenarios, we talk about them in terms of the 3 S's: the shape, the stability, and the severity of our economic impact and recovery. Shape, we talk in terms of letters, and I'll get there in a minute, but it's a V, a U, an L. There's ways we define what happens. There's the stability. Is it smooth or is it lumpy? Are we dealing with multiple waves? And then what is the depth of the shock and how protracted is the shock is where we think about the severity. So just think about those 3 S's, and then let's talk in more detail about what they really mean if we move forward. So let's talk about the different shapes for a minute, because I think it actually is quite helpful to set in our mind the situations and the impact and duration of the effects that we are actually going to feel and actually need to, with our businesses, respond to. The V is the one that I think in most shocks people are hoping for, and a not very deep V is actually the best case, although I think we're beyond that in this crisis at this point in time. But a V basically says we were on a GDP level and an output path, right? We have a shock off of that path and our growth falls, get knocked off of that path, but in a V recovery, we return to our original path with some outsized growth that puts us back on the same trend line in terms of our output path and our growth rate for the economy. So it is absolutely a disruption in a moment in time. It distorts and brings down our productivity for a period in time, but we bounce back to the same path. That's the V. In the U-shaped recovery, what happens is we actually get knocked off of that path. We do not able to recover to that same path over time in terms of our output levels, but we do manage to resume our prior growth rate. So what you see is that, we'll call it a U. We drop down, but then we actually parallel path, but at a lower output level and GDP level. And then the L is actually the one where we see the most lasting damage. We are knocked off of our trend line, we are knocked off of our output, and we actually not only do not recover to that growth level, or to that output level, but we also do not even actually manage to resume our prior growth rate. And so we're now flattening and we're actually losing over time vis-a-vis the old output path we were on. Now, as I said, it's not that any one shape is inherently better. In some cases, a shallower U may actually be better than a very, very, very deep V in terms of the disruption to the economy, the disruption to employment and livelihoods over time. Now, I think, as I said, I think we're beyond the stage of believing we could be in a shallow V, but I do think there is a lot of questions still on where we will end up in terms of the resumption to a recovered state here, given the amount of government support we've been having, given the creativity and innovationness that we have seen in businesses. So still to be determined on where the economy ends up, even if we know we're beyond the most hopeful outcome of a shallow V. We can move forward. So I also want to talk a little bit about the timeline on this more explicitly. I hinted at it earlier, but I think most of us know quite well what the flattened phase feels like, where we're working really hard to bring down the level of the virus and the level of critical care needs below the healthcare system capacity. It does mean dramatic shutdowns in our economies and dramatic disruption to employment and livelihoods at this point in time, and frankly, our normal way of life. But most of us, as Federico was saying, are in that restart phase, and we're working to figure out how to restart the economy and do it with a minimum of virus uptake and virus reholding in our societies and in our communities. And so there's going to be a lot that's exploratory in this fight phase. There's going to be a lot that we have to figure out how much we can release before we actually end up having to tighten down again when we actually see rebounds in the virus spread. Now, I mentioned before the timelines for vaccines and effective therapeutics. We don't know, but we do know that the fight phase is going to be protracted, and therefore what we need to be prepared for as businesses and organizations actually requires us to put in place measures around both our recovery, but also as we think about how we build sustainability and inclusion into that, making sure we're doing in ways that are not short term. We do not believe the fight phase is going to be over, unfortunately, soon in any of the scenarios that we're seeing. But we do also want to be, during that phase, building the seeds for the future. So the most important thing I think I want to leave you with in the scenario section is really that all of what we're talking about in terms of scenario is context. It is not destiny, and we actually have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we think about building forward in inclusive and in sustainable ways. One more bit of encouragement is that when we think about doing this and when we think about building forward better, talked about the ESG performance or performance of the ESG stocks, just wanted to also talk about the sources of value that we see for corporations that do succeed in building sustainability and inclusion into their efforts. There are many sources. It can be reduced cost of operations by being smarter when we think about what we can do in terms of potentially localizing or reducing volatility in the supply chain. It can be top-line impacts when we think about building more inclusive products that expand our market, expand into new revenue streams. It can be the way that the market values our products, knowing that we're reducing the risks and building resilience into what we're doing. There are many sources of value when we do the right thing on sustainability and inclusion for our people, for our customers, for our suppliers at this moment of time and in this moment of need. So I'm going to switch sections now, and we're going to move into the checklist work. What this is as BCG has been working with our clients and our corporate and primarily across the C-suite, because this is a quite broad way of looking things. You know, there have been a number of checklists developed about how do we build back most effectively. I set it up initially as what are the things that we have to do? What are the table stakes? What are the things that are going to enable us to get the businesses back up and running at full tilt, regardless of what scenario, as close to it as possible, regardless of what scenario and context that we are actually living and working within. The other thing I'll say about this checklist is that it is multifunction. It requires a lot of collaboration across the organization. It is not something that one function can own alone. It actually requires cooperation across the whole organization because it is so inclusive. But we do think this is really important. These are things that a lot of the things that businesses are going to need to do to get the business up and running. Let's make sure we do it right. Let's get the sustainability and inclusiveness in. So what we've tried to do here is make sure that we are highlighting the opportunities to build that sustainability and inclusiveness into the things that businesses need to do as they recover as they rebuild, and in many cases, as they reimagine what their business can be and what the value is that it provides. So this is the checklist, and I hope many of you are looking at this on a reasonable size screen, because I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but as I said, we wanted to be quite inclusive. I'm going to give you some time to read it. I'll give you some takeaways on how we looked at this and how we designed this, but as I said, I read it all, I'll let you do that. But we do start, as I said, with some of the things that I'll just call we all have to do. It's how we reopen and how we do that in a really responsible way. In the survey that Federico narrated for us up front, we saw a lot about health and safety and the well-being, and really prioritizing that obviously needs to happen. But not just for our employees or our customers, but playing a role more broadly in society becomes quite important in that phase. You know, as we move forward, we can actually get even more creative about how we do it. We've got more levers, thinking about how we actually build and strengthen our resilience, building that sustainability lens in, highlighting and thinking about materiality in different ways, what has actually changed. We really want to think about diversity inclusion. There's been huge disruptions to employee bases. As our employee base has been reshaped, in some cases reduced, have we protected the diversity and inclusion of our employee base? Have we grown it? How do we really think about a more circular supply chain? What are the opportunities that are presented to us now that we may not have had? Really thinking through all of these. I said it's a bit of an eye chart, but we really wanted to give you the full list. All of these may not be appropriate for every company. We know there are a lot of companies that are struggling with liquidity right now, and M&A is off the table completely. On the other hand, there are some that actually, because of the unique situation, have that option. And using M&A to drive a more sustainable portfolio, to reshape the portfolio in ways that may reduce volatility and may make the company more attractive over the long term to more and more of the investors and more customers, is a real opportunity for some. So we're not saying that every item on here is necessarily an option or even feasible for everybody, but really thinking through this to really push the boundaries of how much we can incorporate at this moment in time as we are building forward better, I think becomes important. The fourth one is really, I want to spend just a minute there because it's really about, in many ways, capturing the value of everything you've done. We've seen a lot of recent research where companies that are focused on ESG and companies that are focused on employee and do well on employee engagement really are getting significant financial benefit, and more than if they're just doing any of these things alone. It's really those companies that are living their purpose. And so we're including that in here because we think that's a very useful umbrella that actually, when that comes together, results in a highly effective functioning across the organization for a lot of the things we're talking about with sustainability and inclusion. So we'll move forward, but just to let you know that BCG and WBCSD are working to get this checklist published. It should be out in the next few weeks at the latest. And so you will have access to this in all of the detail in a way that hopefully you can read even more simply and clearly than you can on your screens today. In addition to that front page, what we've tried to do is actually flesh out the details behind this to provide more guidance, a bit of the how, a bit of the specifics of what we need to do. Just fleshing out right here two of the examples, one about building resilience in your supply chain, one about really thinking through and using this as an opportunity to strengthen the governance, and not just overall governance, but governance as it relates to ESG. Because we all know that some boards are better than others at actually the focus on this and frankly, their understanding of this. But really understanding the how and the specifics of what you can be looking for and what you can be seeking to embed. Bit of a silver lining at this difficult moment in time. Okay. So we've talked about the scenarios. I said they're context, they're not destiny, but they are important for us to understand as they will shape some of our options and help inform where we may actually find more benefit earlier on some of the sustainability options, depending on the shape of our company and the material issues for us. we've talked about the checklist, which I hope you had a few minutes to read as I was narrating a bit. And as I said, we will actually publish. But when you bring those two together and say, if this is the full suite of actions that drive sustainability and inclusion, these are the contexts that we may be operating in through the various phases of the fight that we're engaged in and the future that we're all looking forward to. How do we actually shape that future to be more sustainable and more inclusive? And it's really bringing that together. Where we want to go now, I'll hand to Federico for a poll, and then we'll actually work into an example and hopefully bring some of this to life in a much more sort of tangible and pragmatic way.
Excellent. Thank you, Wendy. So we've got the scenarios who really depend on our perspectives and our views. And of course, we've got the checklist, which is a very practical list of items that businesses can consider in terms of the sustainability recovery. So that's fantastic. And the combination of the two really helps businesses to define the actions that they want to take. So very practical advice. I would like to take the opportunity to ask for opinion from our audience, for the participants. And so we go back to the mentee. So Miriam, would you like to take us through the question we're asking?
Absolutely. So we want to know where you stand as you respond to the COVID-19 crisis and how you're managing it, but through the lens of what Wendy just shared with you, which is how much of sustainability and inclusion is considering to those decisions and those responses that you're developing internally. So our next question is how your company is incorporating sustainability and inclusion into its response and management. Please remember that you should go to menti.com and use the code 761283. If you see a little bit of a delay, just refresh your browser and you should be able to fill in more answers.
Thank you, Miriam. This is great. Let's see what feedback our audience provides in terms of responding to this question. Is your company incorporating sustainability and inclusion into its COVID response and management? So we've got 5 answers. Yes, with a cross-functional team, including sustainability. Yes, with a functional team. With a function team. Yes, with the sustainability team. Each business unit is deciding on their own, and we are not incorporating these elements. And we're beginning to see some strong opinion with relations to having a cross-functional team or the sustainability team. While you were providing your answer, one additional reflection that came to mind as Wendy was going through the scenarios is that, unfortunately, from a timing perspective, it's the 4 stages or of the checklist. I suspect that we'll unfortunately not see a linear progression from 1 to 4. I think it's likely that with the resurgence of cases or a second wave or third wave, or hopefully not a 4th one, but there may be a need to return back to some of the initial phases. And so it's not going to be a linear sequence, but it's going to be more of a little bit of a dance in terms of using that checklist. And so from that perspective, I think it's kind of an interesting tool to help us, to guide us through the different scenarios that each one of us will develop for our own organization. Okay, we're getting some responses. I see that, yes, a cross-functional team still remains the most common response, or the sustainability team. So that's great news in terms of incorporating the sustainability in the response to the COVID, the management of the COVID. Okay, may I suggest we go to a second question? Miriam, would you take us through it?
Yes. We'd like to know more about where you're focusing your efforts. You do not need to stick to one of the answers. It's a multiple question. So please let us know a little bit about where your team is currently focusing those efforts. And this is a little bit of a reflection with the question that you just answered. That said, if you didn't take part in the previous poll, don't be afraid to put your inputs here. It's still valuable. Remember, go to menti.com and use the code 761283. If you have any issues, just refresh the browser or close your browser and open it again, and it should just restart the question for you.
Thank you, Miriam. This is great. We're beginning to collect feedback on the 4 parts of the checklist. Maybe a few more coming in. Okay, good. So we see that we begin to see a pattern in terms of the reopening responsibly and supporting stakeholders as being the 2 leading areas, although just under a third or just over a fourth, depending on how you want to look at it, is really beginning to look at competitive advantage and how to capture value from the impact. I would say that this kind of is a similar picture to what we saw in the earlier edition of the webinar earlier today, where we see the reopening responsibly and supporting stakeholders also confirmed by the participants on that call. In a way, it's kind of probably correlated with the general situation in most countries. We're still under lockdown or concerns in terms of reopening responsibly. So we are actually getting people into their factories, into their supply chain, into their logistics centers, laboratories, offices, and now we're beginning to look at this, moving into the supporting of the stakeholders. But it's also good to see that some are really even further out. So that's great news. Okay, great. May I suggest that we turn to Shalini to be able to address a very interesting case as this is applied to the fast-moving consumer goods vertical.
Great, thank you so much, Federico. Fast-moving consumer goods is a category that includes food and beverage, home and personal care, other items. On the surface, many of the companies that have a wide portfolio of products look like they're doing reasonably well in the current context. But if you look just underneath it, there is a significant amount of froth and flux and change and challenge in the sector, from product categories that have seen massive surges during pantry loading phases like toilet paper, as Wendy mentioned, to ones that were that are primarily used in occasions or locations that are outside the home or at a bar or restaurant, etc., that have seen significant declines. There's also been a lot of shifts in where people are consuming what, and that has resulted in a lot of disruption. So if we go to the next page, we'll talk a little bit about many of these changes that are happening and are being observed. And as we build towards how to use the checklist, the starting point is really understanding all the different changes and dynamics that are happening in an industry. So in the case of FMCGs, many of these changes to supply chain and networks where there are massive surges where product has to be filled into bags and bags have to get to shelves rapidly, but the very global supply chains are getting disrupted in many parts of the world is a reality that many companies are dealing with, and the supply chain is getting stretched and reshaped constantly. The progress to digital for FMCG has historically been slower than other sectors and has been a priority, but has happened slowly. But now with the massive and very quick shift to the e-commerce sector, so for the retail industry, we talk about 5 years worth of changes happening in 5 months. With that kind of rapid change in digital, the companies are having to rethink and accelerate their digital capabilities and their e-commerce capabilities. Consumer behavior is uncertain. There's feedback around the push for private label. There's, of course, significantly increased concern about health and safety for consumers, and also trends that are accelerating that are really about the quality of the ingredients and the source of the inputs. Where is my product coming from, etc. So you've got a lot of different consumer behavior and consumer needs changes happening around the world. And then you combine that with some of the changes that are, many of these companies have good balance sheets, so they have opportunity to really think about where to invest. And they're having to rethink about lots of different new ways of working, from their manufacturing plant to their supply chains to their distribution networks, end to end, having to rethink that. And finally, many FMCG companies are prominent brands and a prominent presence in communities, and with stakeholders. They're very visible, and so the need to think through and identify how to engage and when to engage appropriately and well in the challenges with the communities with COVID and with inclusiveness is something that FMCGs are dealing with. So in this context, if we move to the next page, there are many changes that companies are going to undergo. We expect that FMCG companies are most all of them are going to go through many significant transformations of different parts of their organization. Whether that's supply chain and a look at where to reshore and relocalize supply chains. There's been a huge trend towards extremely global supply chains, and what COVID has brought to light is a need for supply chain resilience and a demand from consumers that is pushing for more relocalization of supply chains. Changes to the assortment mix, changes to digital, as I mentioned before. Private label push. So for instance, some of the surveys show that, where it used to be a few percentage points of the market, now 40, 50, 60% of consumer segments are responding that they will consider and increase their spend on private label. And so for many FMCGs, this is a shift in offerings for new channels with e-commerce, as well as with the competition with private label and a focus on value. The financial position brings to light many opportunities for M&A, as well as the challenges around ways of working and community that we mentioned before. So with all of this happening, if we go to the next slide, there is an opportunity to really embed, and the checklist has a long list of options. We've highlighted a few here, and the details of this, you'll see some are around reopening the business, some are around leveraging, many are actually around leveraging sustainability to advance your competitive advantage. So we'll go into a few examples in a second, but I wanted to pause here to make an important observation, which is the extent to which the levers that are available for FMCG are really about sustainability as a source of advantage. For many other sectors, even consumer-facing sectors, you can take airlines, for instance, or some of the luxury products, etc. For instance, there will be tourism and so on. There will be a lot more around reopening the business responsibly. There's going to be a lot more about fundamentally surviving the crisis. But where for FMCG, the sustainability levers are the broader set of levers that really help you position for the future, position to build forward better, as we've been talking about, and really create a source of advantage and resilience for the long term are many. There are many, many levers available to think through that. And it is a real opportunity and a moment in time for FMCGs to integrate sustainability into the changes that are already happening. So if you think about, if we go to the next page, there are several examples here of what could be done. So as you think about different aspects of the business, so if the company is involved in really reshaping and rethinking supply chains and how to reshore them, building in criteria to understand the ESG standing of the suppliers and having criteria around that, maybe having programs that support the suppliers to meet the ESG and sustainability criteria, to optimize your networks around GHG emissions as well, is a great way to integrate sustainability into the changes that are already happening. And it may stand to simple logic, but it's worth highlighting that this is a once in decades opportunity where things are being reshaped fundamentally. And as a result of a challenging crisis, but there is a moment where things are being rethought. And the ability to build in sustainability now, and the return on the cost of doing that is going to be much lower than trying to retrofit it back later once everything has been built back. And so from an ROI point of view, it is also a smart decision for many FMCGs to make. So we look through this and we see a range of options, and we summarize some of them on this page. Some are along the supply chain. We talk about building the sustainability footprint, to think through your resilience, understanding, projecting what future potential scenarios of shocks could be to your supply chain, and really thinking about where sustainability can help create more resilience to that supply chain is a great opportunity. As consumers start to show their renewed and increased interest in topics around health and safety and wanting to know where their products are coming from, local, etc., enhancing traceability and insight through digital is a clear opportunity, and building circularity in general throughout your supply chain. In the go-to-market and product category, this is a moment for, there's a lot of SKU adjustments that are happening. Many companies have announced that they will be dramatically reducing their SKUs. There will be changes happening to many product portfolios. And this is a great point to rethink with the brand teams, with the product teams, with the packaging teams, etc., of where the opportunities are for the product to be repositioned in an exciting and an interesting way. And finally, from a community engagement point of view, FMCGs, as I mentioned earlier, have recognizable brands, have long supply chains that extend into many, many parts of society. And so the ability to go to government and be part of the solution that government is putting forward, to collaborate in new and interesting way across industries, and across boundaries, and do collective action is a real opportunity at this moment. We're seeing many companies starting to take steps forward in this direction. And so we hope that this checklist in being applied to FMCGs serves as an encouragement for companies to really tackle this with the idea that long-term sustained advantage is possible out of focusing on sustainability and societal impact. So with that, Wendy, I will pass on back to you to talk about a few key takeaways.
All right, we can move forward. Just a couple things I want to make sure that we get a chance to leave you with before we move into what I hopefully will be some rich discussion and your perspectives on what you're experiencing and what you're able to accomplish on this. But first off, I've said it before, but I do think it's important that the context of the economic recovery and the virus is just that, it's context. We know we have to deal with ambiguity, but there is significant opportunity to drive advantage in the adversity and in the difficult situation that we are grappling with right now, given the innovation that I know many of you are actually driving within your companies. I also think that this is an opportunity, as we talk about it, to build forward better, to think about a new that isn't just the normal, but is actually more inclusive and more sustainable than the one that we had before. And I think thinking about how we can shape our recoveries to do that is the challenge for all of us in the context of those recoveries. Hopefully this checklist is a pragmatic resource that you will be able to use to spur some of that thinking. I think that we just really want to make sure that we're using all of the levers that we all have at our disposal at this moment in time and at this moment of challenge to do as much as we can on both those sustainability and the inclusiveness dimensions. And really taking it as a chance to build competitive advantage and a chance to build, yes, the sustainability and inclusion, but stronger companies that are better participants in our society overall. I'll leave it as that, and Federico, hand back to you as we, I think, have another poll and hopefully some discussion time.
Yeah, absolutely, with a great pleasure. Thank you, Wendy. And let's go into the, and Shalini, let's go into the polling question. Oh, Miriam, would you like to take us through this one?
Yes, so now that we've come to the end of the meeting, we wanted to know what was most valuable for you from what you heard from what Wendy shared on the work that we're trying to advance forward. For us, it would be absolutely useful and welcome to hear your thoughts and figure out ways to improve this tool and figure out ways to better engage you in the way that we develop it. So we have a couple of questions coming on.
That's great. Coming, we can see. So you can put the text in, and then we'll have the map. So you can see how different scenarios and the one that you feel is most relevant, but also in terms of scenarios, also in terms of the one that is most relevant for the industry and your geography. So it's a combination of different factors that come together in determining the scenario. And then the checklist is it's one that helps you to think through which one are the most relevant elements that your company needs to think through as a team, as a multifunctional team, and particularly focusing on the sustainability aspects that are at the center of those questions or those checklists, and then develop an action plan that really puts the sustainability at the center of your recovery. Great, we've got a couple more perhaps coming in, but we're beginning to see a pattern showing. So we've got at the center, we've got checklist and scenarios. So glad to see that it's been useful to think it through. But equally, we can see that there's quite a few elements around it that are very interesting in terms of most useful takeaway. So we're talking about the ESG funding. We're talking, the new normal that people are thinking about. Diverse viewpoints. Yep, absolutely. So all the small, let's say perhaps a little less, but all coming through, it really adds to the diversity of the audience as what you have picked up. Great. Well, while we're completing the picking up some of the responses, I was wondering if any of you would have any questions for Shalini and Wendy related to this, or Naomi, or any one of us with regards to some of the things that you have heard, or any comments, whether you agree or not. If you can type them through, then we can make sure that we address them here. That would be great. Okay, I see no questions coming through, so we'll just give it one more second. One interesting question that we heard today, this morning, or earlier today, that we found particularly interesting, that I may want to relate here why you you consider any one of your questions, was if we have any examples of situations that we have observed where businesses and governments, financial institutions, and even all the way to end users and consumers are now collaborating and trying to address some of these issues, so different stakeholders. I think Wendy was mentioned today that with her experience, she's beginning to see some movements in that direction, that certainly government is giving strong support to a recovery, as we have explained in some of the earlier slides. Probably the key example that we have seen in beginning to see this collaboration coming through has been with regards to the collaboration of governments and banks and businesses in flowing through the immediate emergency funds that many governments have released to support the cash flow, particularly of small enterprises, and even particularly those that have very small employee base, very almost family type of companies. So the governments have been releasing the funds, and the financial institutions have been very quick, in most countries have been very quick to pass them through to help with the cash flow crisis that the immediate reduction of demand has caused in the past few weeks. So that's a clear example of one of the lineups that we're beginning to see, where the different stakeholders are beginning to play their part in making sure that the effects and the outcomes were negative outcomes were minimized and turned that into an opportunity. And we do see that in some countries this has had a positive effect in terms of beginning, at least for now, minimizing some of the cash flow and liquidity issues that small businesses might have. Okay, I see no questions. Oh, just one moment. I do see a question from Nazib. Consumer demand will be critical for economic recovery. With loss of jobs, do you expect demand to be impacted severely? Shalini, do you want to see if you want to take that question? So consumer demand will be critical for economic recovery. With job loss, do you expect demand to be impacted severely?
Yeah, it's Nazib, I might give you a unsatisfactory answer a little bit, because I think it's a bit of an it depends. I think what we're seeing is quite a bit of shifts in demand, and as consumers start to worry, and we've been doing several consumer sentiment pulse checks, as consumers start to worry about a recession and with job loss, we're seeing shifts in patterns of spending or planned patterns of spending. And so the private label was one example, but generally a shift towards value and value products is happening. The other shift that is happening is more of a structural change, not just because of job loss, but a structural change where people have shifted where they are consuming, more consumption at home, more grocery purchase, etc., some of which is expected to sustain. So just with any recession, the impact on demand will be there. What's layered on with this challenge is that consumers' patterns of buying, their priorities have also shifted in addition to the typical changes that you expect in a recession. So it's going to be a confluence of both of those factors, and it's going to be category by category impacts.
Yeah. And Sally, just to, maybe an encouragement, if you're interested in going deeper on that, if you look at the BCG website, the consumer sentiment surveys that BCG is doing on an almost weekly basis right now, I think we call them consumer sentiment snapshots. And there's a whole series of those out there, which is tracking consumer demand week by week in different places of the world. So as Shalini said, the degree of variation we're seeing, where, in China, we're seeing so much coming back in some ways, and certainly differences across industries, whereas other places we are still seeing the contraction and the caution. So it's worth looking for, because we do break a lot of it down, both by geography and by sectors.
Yeah, thanks a lot. If I'm not mistaken, I think I saw today about a rebound of consumer spending in the United States, but I was trying to see if I could refine the headline that I saw earlier, but I couldn't. So I'm not sure whether I was dreaming or whether it was real. So maybe somebody in the audience might have seen that coming through to this earlier today as well. All right, if there are no other questions, just give it one more second in case anybody has an additional comment coming through.
There's one, Federico, on the checklist availability. So it'll be published in a few weeks. So the answer is yes, they'll be available for companies to consult. And then there's a new question from Shanka on the circular economy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I must have missed it. So let me read the question. We often talk about circular economy and perpetual value streams. If we move from consumption-based to preservation-based economy, how does the business need to be reinventing the value stream?
Yeah. And I'll ask, Alex, if you've got a stable connection, we've got Alex Myers-Infelde on, who leads a lot of our circular economy work. So if you are on a stable line, I'll ask you to join in. Maybe not. Sorry, go ahead, Federico.
Yeah, no, I think that we can, this is a very good question. I would say my feeling is that, yes, indeed, I think we need to, there are lots of opportunities to think through some of the, the implications with regards to circular economy. I think Shalini was referring to, as far as the FMCGs was thinking about the packaging materials or packaging alternatives, I should say, designed by, design for circular economy is going to be a critical factor. So I would say that it's not just so much about consumption, but it's really about a changing consumer perspective that is changing, that needs to be relooked at. I think more generalizing, I would say that the impression that we get is that regardless of the industry, what companies need to do is really focus at a changing or a demand pattern that is shifting. And that will in turn require, in looking at some of the elements of using the checklist or whatever other framework that you have in mind, in terms of rethinking how the sustainability model can be centered to that, and respond to the new changing demands with a response that addresses that at the center.
Yep. And the one thing I would add on that, Federico, is I actually think it requires creativity, not just across the offering of the value stream and the product stream and those circularity of those products, but it's how actually you interact in terms of how you think about the business model and the creativity and sustainability in that business model. Are businesses renting and taking full ownership of the life cycle of the product in a different way, or changing their pricing so that the pricing is actually more value-based as opposed to the way we think about pricing on many of the products now. So I think that one thing I would just add is that it requires a holistic rethink of the business model, actually, and not just the product value chain per se.
Right. Okay, I see no other questions coming. In the interest of time, I would just move forward. Miriam, if you could have the next slide. We're beginning to get to the closing of the meeting. Right. So let's, wrapping up. So first first I want to express thank you for your attendance and your participation. We will be sharing the slides and the recording of this session for your own use, but also inside your company. The project is going forward, so this is kind of a milestone that we have as part of the work. But in the next couple of weeks, we'll be continuing to apply the checklist and really developing the scenarios depending on what we observe in different countries and the evolution of the epidemic. I encourage you to consider taking part in the work that we do. We are going to continue working on FMCGs. But also we're considering other verticals as part of the work. So we'll be testing it for the automotive, and we are considering other verticals depending on the interest that we see from our member companies. So if you do want to take part in this, please contact myself or Naomi, and we'll make sure that we bring you in and be active part of the work that we do. We have weekly working sessions with the members, and so this will be kind of the rhythm over the next 4 or 5 weeks to put this into a practical application and get your points of view and upgrades on how to use best the checklist. Additionally, and then what we will do is in the latter part of June or early July, we will be publishing a report with recommendations and with a checklist, recommendations, and of course the feedback that we receive from the member companies that are using this. The other thing that I encourage you to do is to go and look at the COVID-19. We are collecting good practices. We hesitate to call them best because it's all relative, but we call them good practices because you have seen how the health and safety of employees is intertwined with the business recovery. And so we have now a single repository with a specific taxonomy that enable businesses to search for the good examples. So we're all in this together. And so if you do have any good examples of how your company is returning employees back to work in a safe way, please let us know and we'll give you the credit and the visibility, but also give others the benefits of your learnings. So if you can participate in that, let me know and we'll make sure that we post that on our repository. Great. With that, I would like to just for a moment to take a time to thank Wendy and Shalini and Naomi. Wendy and Naomi in particular, because you got up in the middle of the night to do this at the earlier hours of the European morning. So thank you for that. And this afternoon for the three of you to really step in and help us out. I also want to thank the whole of the WBCSD team that has worked on this. Tamara and Marine and Irge, Miriam, of course, who's helped us, Bill, and Karim and Mahdi, who's operated the technical platform for us to lead this. So with that, I want to thank you for participating. Please stay safe, yourselves and your families. And please, I hope to be able to hear from you soon with feedback on the event, but also on your participation in the project. Thank you very much.